Hello, hello. Hello, Dolores. Hi, Greg. Hi, Evelina. Hi, Kay. Greg says, meh, I'm okay. Hi again, Dolores, from your YouTube perch. Thank you for going to both places. So let's get right on it. Last night I meant to cover inflation. We've been having some price rises. People are saying it's inflation. Is it really inflation? We'll see. Hi, Deborah Wilson. Hi, Carmen. Carmen's better, but not out of the woods. Thanks for asking. How are you? Greg says, I'm okay, Carmen. Hope you're all good tonight. It's so bad in many parts of the world that we at least should be having a good night tonight. Greg says, 2 words, corporate greed. Greg also says, I'm not okay, Carmen. Corporate greed is right. So let's talk inflation. This post appeared in LA Progressive. That's where I picked it up. It's called Inflation Myths of the U.S. Economic Rebound 2021. And it's got a temperature thermometer, an inflation thermometer, and a prices thermometer. Looks like the prices thermometer is reading the highest. Inflation is slightly lower, and temperature is slightly lower than that. But you wouldn't know about that if you were in Washington today. It was getting up to close to 90 degrees here. Anyway, this piece was authored by Jack Rasmus. We've covered some pieces from him a few times. He used to be the chief economic honcho of the Green Party at one point. He's a pretty good economist, I think. And he talks good sense here. So, on May 12, 2021, the Labor Department released its report on businesses now raising prices as the U.S. economy reopens in the wake of COVID vaccinations and moderating COVID infections. The CPI, or Consumer Price Index, rose 0.8% in April, after a 0.6% in March, and 4.2% for the 12 months ending last month, April 2021, which was the largest increase since 2008. So what happened in 2008? Well, we had the recession, the Great Recession in 2008. And just before the Great Recession, just before the crash, prices were going up. Anyway, Republicans, conservatives, and business interests are using the fact of recent rising prices to attack the proposals to increase government spending. They argue the recently passed $1.8 trillion American Rescue Plan, COVID relief plan by the Biden administration, was too generous. And proposals to spend on infrastructure, 2.2T, and American families, 1.5T, will only stoke consumer spending and boost inflation further. They and their mainstream media friends are arguing that fiscal stimulus, putting money in the hands of households, is driving up prices. In other words, consumer demand is now causing prices to rise sharply, they argue. But is it? Or is the problem of rising inflation a business supply problem? According to Jack, inflation is not due to fiscal spending and household demand. And he says there's little evidence that fiscal stimulus spending is responsible for recent price hikes. The fiscal stimulus spending for 2021 is far less than reported. So its effect on household demand spending and therefore inflation is thus far minimal. The recently passed American Rescue Plan is not actually 1.9T as media reports. The Congressional Budget Office, the research arm of Congress, reports that only $1 trillion in spending is even authorized for 2021, for this year. And of that, at least $200 billion or more won't be spent. In fact, it will be hoarded and unspent by households and local governments or used to pay down debt and won't get into the U.S. economy in 2021. The majority of the remaining $800 billion hasn't even hit the U.S. economy yet and won't until 2021. What about the infrastructure and family assistance subsequent proposals? They're just on paper and won't get passed until sometime in 2022, if then, and certainly reduced and authorized spending by large amounts. In short, the Republican business hype about $6 trillion going to households and consumers is just another, quote, big lie. It's no more than $800 billion. That is just about the amount of similar fiscal spending in 2020 that dissipated in just 2 to 3 months. Put another way, the fiscal stimulus is not really a stimulus, just a mitigation spending measure designed to put a floor under the economy while waiting and hoping for the reopening of the economy to generate a sustained recovery. The fiscal spending of at most $800 billion last year, which has hardly even hit the U.S. economy, yet is not sufficient to generate excess demand by households to cause inflation. So much, therefore, for the argument that government fiscal spending is causing excess household demand that is resulting in current inflation. Inflation, rather, is due to business supply problems. A closer look at the CPI shows the problem of recent rising prices is a supply problem in business, not a demand problem due to households' excess income. Much of the recent CPI increase, when broken down, is due to sharp increases in auto prices, especially used cars. That is a supply problem. Auto companies are experiencing a crisis in obtaining semiconductor chips for production of new cars. So new car production has fallen. That's created a shortage that allows the companies to jack up prices on their new cars. In turn, it has resulted in used car prices rising even further and faster than new cars. New car prices have surged 9.6% and used cars even more, by 16.7%, according to the Wall Street Journal. Auto prices have surged 21% over the past year. April's car and truck double-digit price hikes, the highest since 1953, thus account for more than a third of the overall 4.2% April CPI increase. The 2020 economic contraction resulted in businesses reducing their inventories of unsold goods deeply. They now have shortages. Recent U.S. GDP numbers show inventories collapsed last year and continue to contract in the first quarter of 2021 as well. This has created a condition that now allows businesses to sharply raise prices due to the shortages of supply. This is a condition and problem across many industries and companies today. Businesses in 2020 were not able to raise prices due to the massive unemployment and inability of consumers to spend as the economy was largely shut down. Service industries like airlines, travel, lodging, entertainment, restaurants and bars, and retail were especially hard hit. In response, many of the companies in these industries cut prices in order to try to capture what little household demand there was. Now, as the U.S. economy reopens, they're trying to recoup those losses by sharply raising prices, trying to test what the market will bear in terms of inflation. Looking at the recent CPI numbers once again, apart from oil prices, new and used, the sharpest increases in the CPI index are occurring in airline prices, the travel-related prices, hotels and lodging, and similar services, all rising recently at more than 10%. At the same time, auto insurance companies and utility companies are raising prices by double digits as they price gouge consumers in the recovery. Consumers aren't buying more utilities. That demand remains stable. Nevertheless, the big utility companies are using the opportunity to boost prices. The auto insurance companies experienced a big windfall in profits in 2020 as households drove less and their insurance premiums remained at pre-pandemic levels. But now they too are raising prices by double digits to game the system. Then there's the oil companies sharply boosting prices at the pump to recoup their losses in 2020. Not to be left out, in addition to these supply-driven causes, new housing prices are surging as well as shortages in lumber and other materials, and due to the low availability of housing stock. In other words, a supply problem causing inflation. In other words, this is cost push inflation. It's not a demand pull inflation. Now, global markets are a cause of inflation also. Wholesale prices for commodities like aluminum, copper, and crude oil are all rising sharply, as well as speculators drive up future contracts to resell later at a big profit. These now rising wholesale prices will soon penetrate consumer prices, causing retail price inflation. That means the problem, once again, is not the household consumer and demand. It is the professional financial speculator causing most of the rising world commodity price inflation. And there's the problem of the falling U.S. dollar, which drives up imported goods prices in the CPI. That has nothing to do with household demand either. The Federal Reserve U.S. Central Bank has a policy of keeping interest rates at near zero. It has pumped more than $4 trillion into banks in the past 18 months and continues to provide $120 billion every month to ensure rates stay low. This policy and subsidization of low interest rates has resulted in less foreign investor demand for U.S. dollars to buy treasury bonds that pay little interest. That reduced demand for dollars drives down the value of the U.S. dollar. That lower valued dollar in turn raises the cost and price of imported goods coming to the U.S. Import prices of goods in the CPI therefore rise in turn and contribute to the general increase in the CPI. In short, the falling dollar is a cause of inflation. That has nothing at all to do with excess household demand for goods due to fiscal spending. How reliable is the CPI in general, and especially as a measure of economy-wide inflation? The answer is not very. There are major problems with the CPI as an accurate indicator of the price level, i.e. of inflation. Here's just some of them. First, the CPI is not even an indicator of the general price level and inflation, as economists well know. It is an indicator of cost of living for urban households only. Cost of living and inflation price level are not the same thing. contrary to the general public's understanding of the two concepts. CPI measures only around 450 different goods and services in the economy, i.e., the most purchased by urban households. There are millions of different goods and services in the U.S. economy with prices, none of which are included in the CPI but are part of the general price level. Second, unknown by the public, the U.S. government keeps secret how it calculates most of the CPI. Why so? It says it does that in order not to reveal how businesses raise prices because it would reduce competition among businesses. But that's nonsense. Those businesses, especially the large corporations, know full well how their competitors raise prices. The U.S. government reveals more detail about how it calculates employment and unemployment, but it keeps most of its methods secret about how it manipulates CPI raw data. It does that, in my opinion, in order to lowball inflation. It has an incentive to underestimate the CPI. The higher the inflation, the more government must spend in cost of living for Social Security, food stamps, school lunches, government pensions, and so forth. So it prefers to lowball inflation and does so in a number of ways. Unlike employment stats, it also avoids segmenting inflation by race, age, gender, and income level. That would show how CPI inflation more seriously impacts low-income and minority households. Third, the CPI measures the increase in inflation compared to a similar month or quarter in the previous year. So if prices were falling last spring due to the severe economic contraction, prices this spring, 2021, appear especially high. Businesses are recouping price cuts, deflation last year, so price increases appear even higher this year. In other words, it matters what base year is used to estimate the CPI, or any inflation index for that matter. CPI can be either higher or lower depending upon what base year is used. If the base year was deflationary with falling prices, as was 2020, in the subsequent year 2021, inflation and CPI appear exceptionally higher than otherwise. Apart from the CPI not being an actual measure of the general price inflation, of the general price level, and its methods for estimating inflation kept a secret, there are further problems with the CPI itself. Here's just a few. The CPI's basket of 450 or so goods and services have weights assigned for the various goods and services. In other words, the cost of lodging weighs more in the final CPI calculation than does, for example, the cost of smartphones. But the weights are changed only every 4 to 5 years. The cost of food, autos, or housing may surge significantly in any given year now occurring, but their weights are not changed in order to reflect the increase. CPI is thus underestimated for that year. Moreover, the weights are not segmented by household income levels. So for the median, or even more for the working poor households, the cost of rents result in an even greater inflation effect than for, say, wealthier households. The poor are impacted by inflation more as a result. Their CPI, cost of living, is thus much higher than the general CPI number. CPI makes adjustments for rising quality of goods. For example, even though the cost of a new phone may be higher this year for the buyer because the new phone has more features and functions, the government calculates a zero rise in price or even a price deduction for smartphones in its overall CPI calculation. The buyer consumer may experience an actual price hike, but it doesn't show up in the CPI as such. There's also what's called the substitution bias problem in the CPI. This happens when prices rise for a product in the CPI basket, and the consumer responds by not buying that higher price good and buys instead a lower cost substitute. There's an actual increase in the price level for that original good that isn't captured in the CPI because it hasn't been purchased. New goods and services that are created in the economy and their inflation are not captured because they may be not yet included in the 450 baskets of goods and services of the CPI. Their prices and inflation are for certain part of the general price level rise, but aren't reflected in the CPI. And remember, there are millions of goods and services not included in the CPI. Add to these issues and problems, there's no adjustment for the value of the dollar falling, or for the fact the CPI measures only urban cost of living, or there is no segmentation that would show lower income households. CPI, a flyer. The CPI excludes altogether certain important items that account for inflation. There's no mortgage rates estimated in the CPI or rising income taxes. And many economists argue the CPI still significantly underestimates price increases for online shopping. So to summarize, all the hype from Republicans and mainstream media that the recent and pending fiscal stimulus is driving up inflation has no basis in fact. It is an argument designed to be used to block and roll back the spending that would benefit households and consumption. That argument assumes the emergent inflation is a household demand-driven problem. On the contrary, rising prices are far more a business supply problem. Businesses are using the supply shortages as an excuse to boost prices and to test how much the markets are going to allow to generate and recoup 2020 losses and price cuts during the pandemic. A detailed look at recent CPI numbers shows the biggest increases in prices are due to shortages in supply and those business sectors trying to recoup losses. Other businesses without losses are going along and doing the same, using the rising prices as a cover to raise their prices as well. The Biden fiscal spending is a small fraction of what opponents claim. Only $800 billion will be spent in 2021, and likely less as more workers leave unemployment benefits for jobs. It's not $6 trillion, as the business media in particular likes to tout. $5 trillion of that claim is just talk of legislation that won't hit the economy until 2022 or after, or not at all. And the remainder of the Biden American Rescue Plan of 1.8T is spread out over 10 years. Finally, the CPI is not an indicator of inflation and has a number of serious limits when it comes even to estimating the cost of living in U.S. households. In general, moreover, it grossly underestimates even the cost of living and is not a reflection of rising general prices and inflation. Inflation will rise in 2021 for certain, but it will be more due to business practices and supply problems, as well as other global conditions, and all that has little to do with consumer demand and government fiscal spending programs or legislation. Nonetheless, the U.S. economic ideology machine and its mainstream media conduit will continue to pump out the fiction and myth that it's government spending and excess by U.S. middle class and working class household demand that is the problem behind inflation. So says Jack Rasmus, and I think he's dead right about that, don't you? So moving on, what is the real purpose of austerity? Well, Yanis Varoufakis has an idea about that. It's a pretty good idea. And I'm going to give you his idea right now in an opinion piece for Common Dreams, the real purpose of austerity. And Yanis, who is another very, very good economist, says back in the 1830s, Thomas Peel decided to migrate from England to Swan River in Western Australia. A man of means, Peel took along, besides his family, 300 persons of the working class, men, women, and children, as well as, quote, means of subsistence and production to the amount of 50,000 pounds. Those, of course, were English pounds rather than Australian dollars. But soon after arrival, Peel's plans were in ruins. The cause was not disease, disaster, or bad soil. Peel's labor force abandoned him. got themselves plots of land in the surrounding wilderness, and went into business, quote unquote, for themselves. Although Peel had brought labor, money, and physical capital with him, the workers' access to alternatives meant that he could not bring capitalism. Karl Marx recounted Peel's story in Capital, Volume 1, to make the point that, quote, capital is not a thing, but a social relation between persons, unquote. The parable remains useful today in illuminating not only the difference between money and capital, but also why austerity, despite its illogicality, keeps coming back. For now, austerity is out of fashion, with government spending like there's no tomorrow, or rather to ensure that there is a tomorrow. Fiscal spending cuts to rein in public debt do not rank high among political priorities. U.S. President Joe Biden's unexpectedly large and popular stimulus and investment program has pushed austerity further down the agenda, except among the Republicans, where it's pushed it further up the agenda. But like mass tourism and large wedding parties, austerity is lingering in the shadows, ready for a comeback, egged on by ubiquitous chatter about impending hyperinflation and crippling bond yields unless governments re-embrace it. There is little doubt that austerity is based on faulty thinking, leading to self-defeating policy. The fallacy lies in the failure to recognize that unlike a person, family, or company, government cannot bank on its income being independent of its spending. If you and I choose to save money that we could have spent on new shoes, we will keep that money. But this way of saving is not open to the government. If it cuts spending during periods of low or falling private spending, then the sum of private and government spending will decline faster. This sum is national income. So for governments pursuing austerity, spending cuts mean lower national income and fewer taxes, unlike a household or a business. If the government cuts its spending during tough times, it is cutting its revenue too. But if austerity is such a bad idea, sapping our economies of energy, why is it so popular among the powerful? One explanation is that while they recognize that state spending on the impecunious masses, don't you love that? Impecunious masses, that's us, is an excellent insurance policy against recessions as well as against threats to their property, they are loath to pay the premium taxes. This is probably true. Nothing unites oligarchs more than hostility to taxes. But it does not explain staunch opposition to the idea of spending central bank money on the poor. If you asked economists whose theories align with the interests of the wealthiest 0.1% why they oppose monetary financing of redistributive policies that benefit the poor, their answer would hinge on inflation fears. The more sophisticated would go a little further. Such largesse would eventually hurt its intended beneficiaries because interest rates would soar. The government, immediately facing higher debt payments, would be forced to cut its expenditures. An almighty recession would then ensue, hitting the poor first and foremost. This is not the place for yet another rendition of that debate, but suppose for a moment that, for argument's sake, that everyone agreed that printing another $1 trillion to finance a basic income for the poor would boast neither inflation nor interest rates. The rich and powerful would still oppose it, owing to the debilitating fear they would end up like Peel in Australia. They would have money, but they would be bereft of the power to compel the less moneyed. You're already seeing evidence of this in the United States. Employers are reporting that they cannot find workers as pandemic lockdown rules are lifted. What they really mean is they cannot find workers who will work for the pittance on offer from them. The Biden administration's extension of a $300 a week supplementary payment to the unemployed has meant that the combined benefits workers receive are more than twice the federal minimum wage, which Congress refused to lift In short, employers are experiencing something akin to what happened to Peel soon after he arrived in Swan River. If I am right, Biden is now facing an impossible task because of the way financial markets decoupled after 2008 from actual capitalist production. Every level of fiscal stimulus that he chooses will be both too little and too much. It will be too little because it will fail to generate good jobs in sufficient numbers, and it will be too much because, given many corporations' low profitability and high debt, even the slightest increase in interest rates will cause a cascade of corporate bankruptcies and financial market tantrums. The only way to overcome this conundrum and to rebalance both the financial markets and the real economy is to lift working class Americans' income substantially and write off much of the debt, for example, student loans, that keeps them bogged down. But because this would empower the majority and raise the specter of Peel's fate, the rich and powerful will prefer a return to good old austerity. After all, their most important interest is not to conserve economic potential. It is to preserve the power of the few, to compel of the many. That is just a thought, but a very good thought, I think. After all, their most important interest is not to conserve economic potential. It is to preserve the power of the few to compel the many, their power to compel us. That's what austerity is about. So moving along, a really interesting piece from Ellen Brown this week. Haven't seen much from Ellen lately. It's from ScheerPost. And Robert Scheer, in case you have forgotten, used to be the editor-in-chief at Truthdig. Then there was a labor dispute at Truthdig, and a whole bunch of people walked out in support of Scheer, who was getting fired. So he started his own outlet, and Ellen Brown writes occasionally for that outlet. And the title of her blog is How America Went from Mom and Pop Capitalism to Techno-feudalism. Interesting term. This is May 18th, 2021. The crisis of 2020 has created the greatest wealth gap in history. The middle class, capitalism, and democracy are all under threat. What went wrong and what can be done? And Ellen Brown says, in a matter of decades, the United States has gone from a somewhat benign form of capitalism to a neo-feudal form that has created an ever-widening gap in wealth and power. In his 2013 bestseller, Capital in the 21st Century, French economist Thomas Piketty declared that, quote, the level of inequality in the U.S. is probably higher than in any other society at any time in the past, anywhere in the world, unquote. In 2014 podcast about the book, Bill Moyers commented, here's one of its extraordinary insights. We are now really all headed into a future dominated by inherited wealth. As capital is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, giving the very rich ever greater power over politics, government, and society. Patrimonial capitalism is the name for it, and it has potentially terrifying consequences for democracy. Paul Krugman maintained in the same podcast that the United States is becoming an oligarchy, a society of inherited wealth, quote, the very system our founders revolted against. It is a truly revolting system, isn't it? While things have only gotten worse since then, thanks to the economic crisis of 2020, it's worth retracing the history that brought us to this volatile moment. The sort of capitalism on which the United States was originally built has been called mom and pop capitalism. Families owned their own farms and small shops and competed with each other on a more or less level playing field. It was a form of capitalism that broke free of the feudalistic model and reflected the groundbreaking values set forth in the Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including the rights to free speech, a free press, to worship and assemble, and the right not to be deprived of life, liberty, and property without due process. Well, I think that statement on her part is an exaggeration, of course, as we all know, but I think we get her point. It was good in theory, but there were glaring, inhumane exceptions to this idealized template, including the confiscation of the lands of indigenous populations and the slavery that then prevailed. The slaves were emancipated by the Civil War, but while they were freed in their persons, they were not economically free. They remained entrapped in economic serfdom. Although black and indigenous communities have been disproportionately oppressed, poor people were all trapped in indentured servitude of sorts, the obligation to serve in order to pay off debts, and the debts of Irish workers to pay for passage to the United States, and the debts of sharecroppers, 2/3 of whom were white, who had to borrow from landlords at interest for land and equipment. Today's prison system has also been called a form of slavery, in which free or cheap labor is extracted from poor people of color. To the creditors, economic captivity actually had certain advantages over chattel slavery, ownership of humans as a property right. According to an infamous document called the Hazard Circular, circulated by British banking interests among their American banking counterparts during the American Civil War, slavery is likely to be abolished. This is a quote. Slavery is likely to be abolished by the war power and chattel slavery destroyed. This I and my European friends are glad of, for slavery is but the owning of labor and carries with it the care of the laborers, while the European plan, led by England, is that capital shall control labor by controlling wages. Slaves had to be housed, fed, and cared for. Free men housed and fed themselves. Free men could be kept enslaved by debt, by paying them wages that were insufficient to meet their costs of living. From industrial capitalism, quote unquote, to finance capitalism, quote unquote, the economy crashed in the Great Depression. I think Ellen has really abbreviated our history considerably, but she's painting a broad picture. The economy crashed in the Great Depression when Franklin D. Roosevelt's government revived it and rebuilt the country through a public financial institution called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which, by the way, was started under Hubert Heaver, but used expertly by Franklin Roosevelt to help to pull us out of the Depression. After World War II, the U.S. middle class thrived. Small businesses competed on a relatively level playing field, similar to the mom-and-pop capitalism of the early pioneers. Meanwhile, larger corporations engaged in industrial capitalism, quote unquote, in which the goal was to produce real goods and services, but the middle class, considered the backbone of the economy, eroded since the 1970s. The 1-2 punch of the Great Recession, what the IMF has called the, quote, Great Lockdown, unquote, has again reduced much of the population to indentured servitude, while industrial capitalism has largely been displaced by finance capitalism, in which money makes money for those who have it, quote, in their sleep, unquote. As economist Michael Hudson explains, unearned income, not productivity, is the goal. corporations take out cheap 1% loans, not to invest in machinery and production, but to buy their own stock, earning 8 or 9%, or to buy out smaller corporations to eliminate competition and create actual monopolies. Former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis explains that, quote, capital, unquote, has been decoupled from productivity. Businesses can make money without making profits on their products. As Kevin Cahill described the plight of people today in a book titled Who Owns the World, quote, these latter-day pharaohs, the planet owners, the richest 5%, allow the rest of us to pay day after day for the right to live on their planet. And as we make them richer, they buy yet more of the planet for themselves and use their wealth and power to fight amongst themselves over what each possesses, though of course it's actually us who have to fight and die in their wars. The 2020 knockout punch. The final blow to the middle class came in 2020. Nick Hudson, co-founder of a data analytics firm called Panda, Pandemics Data Analysis, argued in an interview following his keynote address at a March 2021 investment conference. Lockdowns, quote, lockdowns are the most regressive strategy that has ever been invented. The wealthy have become much wealthier. Trillions of dollars of wealth have been transferred to wealthy people. Not a single country did a cost-benefit analysis before imposing these measures. Policymakers followed the recommendations of the WHO based on predictive modeling by the Imperial College London that subsequently proved to be wildly inaccurate. Later studies have now been done, at least some of which have concluded that lockdowns have no significant effects on case numbers, that the costs of lockdowns substantially outweigh the benefits in terms not just economic costs, but of lives. Well, that may be, but I seem to remember the lockdown in New Zealand right at the beginning was the key to their ending up with only 5 fatalities per million, while we have ended up with something like 1,900 fatalities per million. So I don't know if I accept that case that lockdowns have no significant effects on case numbers. Seems to me it matters how strict the lockdown is and how strict your testing and your contact tracing and your quarantining is. On the economic front, global lockdowns eliminated competition from small and medium-sized businesses, allowing monopolies and oligopolies to grow. Quote, the biggest loser from all this is the middle class, wrote Logan Kane on Seeking Alpha. By May 2020, about 1 in 4 Americans had filed for unemployment, with over 40 million Americans filing jobless claims, and 200,000 more businesses closed in 2020 than the historical annual average. Just a question. If 40 million Americans filed jobless claims because they lost their jobs, how many million Americans lost their health insurance? Since health insurance is tied to employment, did all 40 million lose their health insurance? And do they still not have health insurance? How many of them still do not have health insurance? Because before the pandemic, there were still 32 million Americans who did not have any health insurance under the Affordable Care Act. Do we now have 72 million Americans who don't have insurance? Or did 20 of those 40 million get jobs back and get insurance back, so that now we have only 52 million Americans who don't have health insurance? I digress, though. And 200,000 more businesses closed in 2020 than the historical annual average. Meanwhile, U.S. billionaires collectively increased their total net worth by $1.1 trillion during the last 10 months of 2020, and 46 people joined the billionaire class. Congratulations to you, 46 people. The number of centibillionaires, individuals with a net worth of $100 billion or more, also grew. In the U.S., they included Jeff Bezos, whose net worth increased from $113 billion in March 2020 to $182 billion in March 2021, up by $70 billion for the year. Elon Musk, he's probably done the least of anybody in terms of actually producing and selling things, but somehow his net worth increased from $25 billion in March 2020 to $164 billion in March 2021, up by $139 billion for the year. And Bill Gates, don't ask me. That's a miracle of the stock market. Bill Gates, formerly CEO of Microsoft and currently considered the global vaccine czar, whose net worth increased to $124 billion in March 2021, up by $26 billion for the year. Two others are almost centibillionaires. The net worth of Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook, grew from $55 billion in March 2020 to $95 billion in March 2021, up by $40 billion for the year. Excuse me, please. The net worth of Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway grew from $68 billion in March 2020 to $95 billion in 2021, up by $27.6 billion for the year. These five individuals collectively added $300 billion to their net worth just in 2020. For perspective, that's enough to create 300,000 millionaires, or to give 100,000 to 3 million people. I can't wait to get that 100,000. A philanthrocapitalism, the need to shield the multi-billionaire class from taxes and to change their predatory corporate image, has given rise to another form of capitalism called philanthrocapitalism. Wealth is transferred to foundations or limited liability corporations that are designated as having charitable purposes but remain under the ownership and control of the donors who can invest the funds in ways that serve their corporate interests. As noted in the Reporter magazine of the Rochester Institute of Technology, essentially what we are witnessing, this is a quote, is the transfer of responsibility for public goods and services from democratic institutions to the wealthy to be administered by an executive class. In the CEO society, the exercise of social responsibilities is no longer debated in terms of whether corporations should or shouldn't be responsible for more than their own business interests. Instead, it is about how philanthropy can be used to reinforce the politico-economic system that enables such a small number of people to accumulate obscene amounts of wealth. With $100 billion, nearly anything can be bought, not just land and resources, but media and journalists, political influence and legislation, by regulators, university research departments, and laboratories. Jeff Bezos now owns the Washington Post. Bill Gates is not only the largest funder of the World Health Organization and the Imperial College of London, but the largest owner of agricultural land in the United States. And Elon Musk's aerospace manufacturer, SpaceX, has effectively privatized the sky. Astronomers and stargazers complain that the thousands of satellites it has already launched, with many more in the works, are blocking their ability to see the stars. The astronomy professor Samantha Lawler writes in a piece for The Conversation, quote, SpaceX has already received approval for 12,000 Starlink satellites and is seeking approval for 30,000 more. Other companies are not far behind. The point of the Starlink mega constellation is to provide global internet access. It is often stated by Starlink supporters that this will provide internet access to places on the globe not currently served by other communication technologies, but currently available information shows the cost of access will be too high in nearly every location that needs internet access. Thus, Starlink will likely only provide an alternate for residents of wealthy countries who already have other ways of accessing the internet. With tens of thousands of new satellites approved for launch and no laws about orbit crowding, right-of-way, or space cleanup, the stage is set for the disastrous possibility of Kessler syndrome, a runaway cascade of debris that could destroy most satellites in orbit and prevent launches for decades. Large corporations like SpaceX and Amazon will only respond to legislation, which is slow, especially for international laws and consumer pressure. Our species has been stargazing for thousands of years. Do we really want to lose access now for the profit of a few large corporations? Public advocacy groups such as the Cellular Phone Task Force have also objected due to health concerns over the increasing amount of electromagnetic radiation. But the people have little say over public policy these days. So concluded a study summarized in January 2021 article in Foreign Affairs. Princeton professor and study co-author Martin Gillens wrote, ordinary citizens, quote, ordinary citizens have virtually no influence over what their government does. In the United States, government policymaking over the last few days reflects the preferences of economic elites and of organized interests. Varoufakis calls our current economic scheme post-capitalism and, quote, techno-feudalism, unquote. As in the medieval feudal model, assets are owned by the few. He notes that the stock market and the businesses in it are essentially owned by three companies, the giant exchange traded companies, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Under the highly controversial Great Reset envisioned by the World Economic Forum, quote, you will own nothing and be happy, unquote. By implication, everything will be owned by the techno-feudal lords. Getting back on track, the capitalist model has clearly gone off the rails. How to get it back on track? One obvious option is to tax the uber rich. As Chuck Collins, author of The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions, 2021, writes in a March 2021 article, quote, a wealth tax would reverse more than a half century of tax cuts for the wealthiest households. The billionaires have seen their taxes decline roughly 79% as a percentage of their wealth since 1980. The effective rate on the billionaire class, the actual percentage paid, was 23% in 2018, lower than for most middle-income taxpayers. He notes that Senator Elizabeth Warren and co-authors recently introduced legislation to levy a 2% annual tax on wealth starting at $50 million, rising to 3% on fortunes of more than $1 billion. The tax, which would apply to fewer than 100,000 of the U.S. residents, would raise an estimated $3 trillion over the next decade, would be paid entirely by multi-millionaires and billionaires who have reaped the lion's share of wealth gains over the last 4 decades, including during the pandemic. Varoufakis contends, however, that taxing wealth will not be enough. The corporate model itself needs an overhaul to create a humanist, quote-unquote, capitalism, he says. Democracy needs to be brought to the marketplace. Politically, one adult gets one vote, but in corporate elections, votes are weighted according to financial investment. Largest investors hold the largest number of voting shares. Varoufakis argues that the proper principle for reconfiguring the ownership of corporations for a market-based society would be one employee, one share, not tradable, and one vote. On that basis, he says, we can imagine as an alternative to our post-capitalist model, a market-based democratic society without capitalism. Yet another proposed solution is a land value tax, restoring at least a portion of the land to the commons. As Michael Hudson has observed, quote, there is one Achilles heel in the global strategy, an option that remains open to governments. This option is a tax on the rental income, the, quote, unearned income, unquote, of land, natural resources, and monopoly takings. Reforming the banking system is another critical tool. Banks operated as a public utility could allocate credit but for productive purposes serving the public interest. Other possibilities include enforcement of anti-monopoly legislation and patent law reform. Perhaps, however, the flaws in the competitive capitalist model itself, the winners will inevitably capture and exploit the losers, creating an ever-growing gap in wealth and power. Studies of natural systems have shown that cooperative models are more efficient than competitive schemes. That does not mean the sort of cooperation, quote, cooperation, unquote, coerced through iron-fisted totalitarian control at the top. We need a set of rules that actually levels the playing field, rewards productivity, and maximizes benefit to society as a whole, while preserving the individual rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. Well, I don't know if that's a solution that Ellen Brown has offered. It sounds good, but it's a little too vague, I think, to actually be a solution and to even suggest how we could possibly get there. But I appreciate the thought, and I like her analysis, in this, and her account of the evolution of things to techno-feudalism. I think that's a very useful perspective for us to think in terms of, and to consider. So, next, there's a great piece by Matt Stoller which is about the antitrust establishment. It's from his big newsletter on May 14th, and Matt writes, antitrust establishment is confused as big tech foe Lina Khan gets overwhelming support from Congress. Says the antitrust establishment is confused and upset. Good. One of the more remarkable appointments for Joe Biden is that of Lina Khan to the Federal Trade Commission, which is one of the two government departments tasked with enforcing antitrust laws. Khan made her bones exposing how lax antitrust law enabled Amazon's dominance. So when he nominated her, the antitrust establishment was utterly horrified. Quote, putting more extremists on the commission is not the way to do better, unquote, said University of Pennsylvania law professor Herb Hovenkamp, who is probably the most important antitrust scholar of the last generation, and whose work has been essential in eroding the foundations of anti-monopoly law. That is Lina Khan testifying before Congress. Hovenkamp, who is generally a booster of large technology firms, told the National Journal that Khan's, quote, radical views, unquote, make it hard to see how she could get any Republican votes, and she might even fail to be confirmed as a Democrat or two might have doubts about her ability to do the job. Actually, she was confirmed. Surprisingly, she was confirmed. All the Democrats stuck together, and she got confirmed. Hovenkamp is not some random law professor. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer once noted that advocates would rather have, quote, 2 paragraphs of Hovenkamp's treatise on their side than 3 courts of appeals or 4 Supreme Court justices, unquote. Hovenkamp has been cited by the Supreme Court in 38 different cases, far more often than, say, Robert Bork. His thunderous anger at Kahn represents a broad swath of the center-left antitrust establishment's frustration towards the broader anti-monopoly movement. It's not just Hovenkamp. Fiona Scott Morton, a Yale Business School professor, adjunct at the law school, who started a center at her university to study monopolies after working in the Obama administration's often criticized antitrust division, also had choice words about Kahn. Quote, having radical ideas is fun, but it's not what the day job is going to be in terms of bringing cases and voting on cases and winning cases, unquote, she said. Quote, Paulina Kahn may advocate for breakups as a commission, but what's the authority under which you would do that? The FTC can't just announce that they'd like to break up some corporation, unquote. But Morton's public lobbying against Kahn is likely ideological, not a result of her consulting contracts with Amazon and Apple. But it is still shocking, he says. So what happened? Did Hovenkamp's predictions that Kahn would face a unified Republican opposition and perhaps the Democratic opposition pan out? No. 2 days ago, Kahn not only got every Democrat in the Senate Commerce Committee, but 8 out of 12 Republican votes. That means she'll probably get something on the order of 70 to 80 votes on the floor of the Senate. That's a power move for a number of reasons. One, it means that Kahn is going into the FTC with a mandate from the Senate to take on big tech. The senators know who she is. They questioned her on what she believes, and they voted for her. So officials at the discredited commission know that when she speaks, she is commanding significant political clout. 2, Kahn's Senate vote flips the traditional political axis. Traditionally, it's been hard to get progressives into positions of authority, which is why Hovenkamp assumed that Kahn would have a rough political road. But in this case, it's precisely Kahn's aggressive take on the need to break up big tech that drew interest from the GOP. And 3, the main critique of the anti-monopoly movement on the right is that it's fake and cynical, a ruse to pressure big tech into better treatment of conservatives rather than to make real policy changes on concentrated power. Now that significant number of Republicans have voted for Kahn. There's no way to dismiss tech skepticism on the right as merely superficial. Broadly speaking, it's not Kahn or anti-monopolists who are considered fringe. It's law professors like Herb Hovenkamp, holdovers from another era, when supporting monopoly power made you one of the cool kids. So Stoller is saying, supporting monopoly power no longer makes you one of the cool kids. Now you're one of the cool kids if you want to go after monopoly power. And that's even true from the Republican side as well. The conservatives are no longer liking monopoly power, evidently. Maybe that's what the appointment of Kahn portends. I certainly hope so. Now, I wanted to go over climate and infrastructure tonight, too. Okay, I won't have much time for that. So I think I'm going to leave that for tomorrow night and go instead right to your comments. So I left where Greg said 2 words, corporate greed. Greg Mallet says, but Bill Mitchell has a great article on this topic. Thank you for telling me, Greg. I haven't seen it yet, but I will immediately go and take a look at it. I assume that it's at his blog. And Carmen says, Joe, I saw that the Orthodox Jews were protesting on behalf of the Palestinians in Israel. I was so surprised. I never expected that. Well, some of the Orthodox Jews have always been against the state of Israel from the start. They never liked it, okay? But there are other Orthodox Jews, like the settlers, okay, who are completely in league with the right wing of the Israeli state, who have been getting protection from the Israeli state for a very long time. So you have to resist the temptation of looking at the Orthodox Jews as though they're monoliths. They're not monoliths. Some of them are anti-nationalists, and they have been from the very foundation of the state of Israel. There were Jews inside of Israel, even before Israel started, that they were so traditional and so orthodox that if you went into their neighborhoods, if you drove into their neighborhoods on Saturday, they would stone your car. That's what some of them think. That's how strict some of them are. Okay, says we went from snow last week to mid-80s this week. Shake my head. I hate climate change. Greg Mallet says, I'm not looking forward to hurricane season. I might be in the crosshairs of one. Okay, says a possible one in the Atlantic now. Greg says we should be making those chips here in the USA. But Milana said, I didn't see your announcement. It was on Twitter, Lana. Unless something happened to my tweet. Let me check that out. I think I sent a tweet. Of course, I was in a big rush, so maybe I screwed up. But let me see. Now let me double check. Yep, I tweeted you 2 hours ago. And I tweeted you with a promo as well. Right. I tweeted you with the promo 2 hours ago. So, right. So you should have gotten the announcement. That was the announcement. Greg says the reason why plywood is hard to get is because the adhesive used in making them come from China. Carmen says, hi, Bonnie, what you doing? Carmen said that at 9:18. Kay Clark said, too many things come from China now. Evelina said, speculators messing around with the economy affect every one of our households. They should be regulated. Carmen says, friendly reminder, Reduced Wi-Fi is available now for fixed or low-income households. Okay, I hope it's high-speed Wi-Fi and not slow speed. Steve Gonzo says, "Ooh, I'm stuffed. Gonzo bot engage." Evelina says, "Dead right he is. Fiscal spending will continue to be their pretext for inflation." Kay says, "Austerity kills." Yes, it does. Carmina says, "Damn fascist book just threw me in jail for a cartoon about an Israeli soldier with his gun to a Palestinian child and catching his reflection, in a mirror as a Nazi doing that to his people. Yes, I'm going to contest it after this stream." You should, Carmen. I mean, you should. It's really pretty damn factual. And the Israelis should be looking it in the face. And fascist books should be looking it in the face, too. Kay says, "I used to listen to Moyers all the time." Carmen Runa says, "To a Palestinian child's head." Bonnie says, "Hi, everyone. I have been watching for a while." Deborah says, "Economic serfdom, all right." Carmen Runa says, "The McDonald's workers really started striking today." Yes, they did. Kay says, "I'm fighting to keep my Medicaid yet again up here in Ohio. We need single payer now." I know. We've needed it forever. And Steve gives us something from Twitter. I don't know what. Kay says, "Yep, I never get my stimulus until May, and then Medicaid comes back to haunt me. I hate that." Steve Gonzo says, 35 R's back the blue and 1/6 commission vote. 175 voted against. What say you, Senate? That's interesting. 35 of the Republicans crossed over on the commission in the House. I did not know that. That is a hopeful sign for January 6th, a commission. In other words, a commission to investigate what happened on January 6th. 35 of the Republicans voted for that. That's a big surprise. Of course, 175 of them supported Trump, but still, 35 of the Republicans and all the Democrats is a pretty big House majority. That's encouraging. Kay says, "They say no way, Steve Gonzo." And Carmen Muniz, yeah. Steve Gonzo says, Carmen says, 35 of the Republicans actually voted with Democrats today to approve the 1/6 investigation commission. Good that not all of them are cowering to Trumpism. Exactly. Steve says, "Have our friendly, red-eyed, screaming neighborhood cicadas arrived? I haven't seen or heard any." We haven't heard any cicadas here either. Yet. Steve Gonzo says, "The same Dems on social media today voicing their support for McDonald's workers are the same Dems who made the decision not to include a $15 an hour minimum wage hike in the reconciliation bill. Or why? Was Sinema and Joe Manchin in support of the McDonald's workers?" Carmen Yunus says, "Thanks for clearing that up about the Orthodox Jews." Lana says, "The tweet never reached me in either place. Not sure what happened." That's weird because it says at Organic Fanatic. Oh, wait a minute. That's actually my mistake, because You are Organic Fanatic 5. That's what explains it, Lana. I'm sorry. It is my mistake. The tweets are there, but they went to Organic Fanatic, not to Organic Fanatic 5. I'm sorry. I wasn't careful enough. Steve Gonzo says the U.S. military is operating a 60,000 troops strong secret army without any congressional oversight, spending at least $900 million on it annually, thus violating many U.S. laws as well as the Geneva Convention. Well, that's certainly very interesting, but if they are, I suspect that the DOD is not going to be operating it for very long under Biden, especially if the story comes out. Lana says, Carmen, now you know a big reason why I gave up on my Facebook page. And my mother is dead, and I don't need FB algorithms to attempt to tell me how to behave. I'm done with it. And Balana says, okay, thanks. Sorry, Lana, I'll be very careful next time. I won't make that same mistake again. Okay, folks, I've come to the end of your comments. So I'll be saying good night until tomorrow, when I'll have some coverage of the climate and other issues for you, okay, as well. There are many, many issues to cover. I never run out of issues to cover. For example, there's a lot of foreign policy as well. And who knows what will be new tomorrow. I don't think there's going to be a settlement. Okay, I don't think there's going to be a settlement. I don't think there's going to be a ceasefire tomorrow. That's going to go for some time. Carmen says, gotcha, Lana. I only stay for Joe. And thank you, Carmen. And Dolores Pierce says, thank you and good night, all. Kay says, thank you for another great discussion. I love you all, and we love you, Kay. Have a great night. I will see you later.